Hi, I'm Dr. Ben Safranski. It feels like it's been a nice long Christmas break, but we're back. Welcome to the Bible and the Eucharist. This is episode 8. And today I want to talk to you about the multiplications of the loaves and fishes. And that's right, I said multiplications because even though we don't talk about this very much, there's more than one, at least in Matthew and Mark. So the multiplications of the loaves and fishes is one of those stories that actually appears in all four Gospels. There aren't very many of those, but when you see one of them, it indicates just how important that story is in the early Christian tradition, the fact that it is recorded by all four of the evangelists. Now I'm going to talk about the multiplication in the Gospel of John when I do an episode specifically on John in a couple weeks. So today what I'm really going to be focusing on is the stories of the multiplications in Matthew. Now I want to give this its own episode because there may not be another story in the New Testament that is neglected to the extent that this one is in terms of its teaching on the Eucharist. If you want to find the Eucharist and the gospel teaching about the Eucharist, other than going to the Last Supper, there is no better place to go than to the multiplications. There's so much. So we don't really often hear about the Eucharistic meaning of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. What do we usually hear about? Well, I think in preaching and teaching, we often hear the question addressed to like, was it really a miracle? Did Jesus really make extra bread or extra fish come out of nowhere? Or is it something about sharing with others? I've heard homilies like that before, where it was said that the story of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes was really that all those people out there, they had something to share, but they were selfishly trying to keep it to themselves. And through Jesus' teaching, they were inspired to share. Well, I'm going to kind of prescind from that question. I'm not really going to address the question of whether Jesus really performed a miracle in multiplying the loaves and fishes, because that's not really what the story is about. When the gospel writers put these stories in, those are not the questions they wanted you to ask. Okay, so I'll come back to that. I want to talk a little bit about the structure and the placement of these stories because they say very important things. Now, we often don't get this as modern readers, but in the Gospels, just like in everything written in the ancient world, the way you structure your stories and the way you place different episodes say very important things in and of themselves. Now, Luke is a little bit different. Matthew and Mark are quite similar, and I'm going to kind of focus in especially on Matthew. So in Matthew, the first multiplication comes right after the death of John the Baptist. Now that's not an accident, just like nothing in the Gospels is an accident. Who is John? Well, John is the herald of what is coming next. He is the herald of who is coming next, of Christ and the important work that he came to do. So why is it important that the multiplication comes right after the death of John the Baptist? Because this tells us that what we're about to see is the important work that John heralded. Now, of course, John heralded the person of Christ, and he heralded everything Christ did. So it's not limited, but it is very important that this comes right after his death. When the people approach Jesus, it's like Jesus is saying to them, he sent you to me, and this is what I'm going to do for you. This is what I'm going to give you. Okay? So the placement is important. Now, the one other thing that's important is the fact that there are two stories of multiplication. And when I get into those stories, I'll say a few more things about the differences between them and why they're important. But the fact that there are two is important, and what comes in between is important. This is an ancient literary practice that we call inclusio, right, or inclusion. So whenever you see two stories that are the same or are very similar or refer to the same people, refer to the same issues, kind of in close-ish proximity, you need to look in between and see what happens in between the two, because the author is trying to tell you something by placing those two stories essentially as bookends. In Matthew and Mark, what is it that the two multiplication stories are bookending? What they are bookending are stories that put on display for us Jesus' power, his authority, and ultimately his status as the Son of God. What does he do in those stories? He heals people. He interprets Torah authoritatively, which again is something that we tend to miss, but was one of the most important things that Jesus did to his original Jewish hearers. The fact that he interpreted Torah not as a rabbi did, but as the author would. He interpreted it authoritatively. So the question is asked of us, kind of in between these two multiplications, how do we relate to Jesus? When we see his status as the Son of God, and we see how it is displayed through the healings and the teachings, do we acknowledge that status by placing our trust and our faith in him? All right. So in these multiplication stories, Jesus is teaching us something about how to trust in him, how to have faith in him. Now, the first story itself begins when Jesus retreats to be alone after John the Baptist's death. This makes sense when you think about the fact that not only was John related to Jesus as the herald to the coming Messiah, but as a cousin. And so it makes sense that John the Baptist's death would affect him strongly. And so Jesus retreats to be alone. Now, whenever Jesus retreats to be alone, typically a crowd follows him, and they did. Now, Jesus didn't tell them to go away. He had compassion on them, and he healed their sicknesses and their wounds, right? And then after that, we get the story proper. I want to read basically the entire story of the first multiplication from Matthew. This is in chapter 14, verses 15 through 20. Quote, "When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, 'This is a lonely place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves.' Jesus said, 'They need not go away. You give them something to eat.' They said to him, 'We have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish.' And he said, 'Bring them here to me.' Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over." Unquote. All right, so what is this story intended to teach the Christians who hear and read it? Again, we're kind of prescinding from the question of what the people saw who were there in the beginning, because we're not those people. We are the community that comes after reading and hearing this story. And what is it meant to teach us? Well, from the beginning, the story connects with our experience as disciples of Jesus who live after he has ascended to heaven. Because, well, why is that? Well, what happens in the beginning? Jesus has gone away, and the people follow him, seeking to be filled. Right? That's what disciples do. That's what disciples of Jesus do. From the beginning, we have to come to grips with the fact that in a certain way he has left the earth, and yet we know that to be filled, we have to find him. Okay? So when they find him, and they find his disciples, what do the disciples say? Well, they tell Jesus to send the people away into the surrounding world. Jesus won't do that, though. Why? Because the surrounding world that you reach by leaving Jesus cannot fill you. Right? Jesus knows this. He knows that because this story isn't really about physical eating, or at least isn't about physical eating for the sake of being filled, he knows that the world away from him cannot satisfy them. So he will fill the people who follow him, but remember, he has left us in a certain way, right? At the ascension. So how is he going to fill us? He's going to do it through the ministry of the apostles. Did you ever read this story or hear this story and wonder, why does Jesus feed the people through the ministry of the disciples? Why doesn't he just snap his fingers and give everyone a meal, an amazing meal in front of them? That's because this story is trying to tell us, the Christians who come after, that the primary way Jesus is going to fill us is through the ministry of his disciples, is through the ministry of the church. So that's how he is going to fill us as he fills the people in this story. Now, he fills them just like he fills us by giving not just a kind of physical meal, physical food, but a sacred meal. And this is why if you hear, teaching or preaching on this story that just focuses on the mechanics of the multiplication, or focuses on people sharing or being kind of physically filled, that is extremely deficient. It is not how the original Christians would have understood this story, because every single original Christian, every single Jew who followed Jesus could see that what he was doing was a sacred meal and not just a normal secular meal, right? And we know that because he follows the basic fourfold structure of a Jewish sacred meal. This happens when he takes the bread, blesses it, breaks it, and gives it to the disciples in order to give to everyone else. That is the typical fourfold structure of a Jewish sacred meal. And everyone who presumably was there with him, as well as everyone who originally read this story or heard this story, knew that this was a sacred meal. And so it's not just about physical filling, it's about spiritual filling. Now, every Christian after Christ ascends, who hears this story, reads this story, also knows that it is straight up about the Eucharist. How do they know that? Because the whole meal screams what we experience in the Eucharist. Number one, sacred meal based on the essential Jewish structure, that fourfold structure, take, bless, break, give. Number two, the fact that there is enough for all when you only start with a small amount, right? That's That's the miracle of the Eucharist that we don't talk about so much, is the fact that we can all receive Christ's body and blood when in reality, or when in a physical sense, his body on earth only had a very limited amount of flesh and blood. The fact that it essentially multiplies through God's miracle, right? And then lastly, the fact that this sacred meal is mediated to us through the disciples. Okay? So at the end of the meal, there are 12 baskets left over. Again, have you ever asked yourself, why are there 12 baskets left over? Was Jesus really good at multiplying and really bad at measuring? No. There are 12 baskets left over to represent the 12 tribes of Israel, or all of the people of Israel. Why? Right? Well, this tells us that Jesus came, first of all, to be Messiah for the people of Israel, and was offering them the gift of himself in the Eucharist, was offering that, in a sense, he was offering it first to the Jews, right? The chosen people, they're not first in greatness, right? God does not love them more than he loves other people, but they do have a kind of priority. They're the first chosen. They're the ones that have been following God for centuries and centuries. So they essentially get the first offer. They're the ones sitting in the front pew at Mass, basically. Okay? So we have the middle part that I mentioned before about Jesus teaching and healing, and about his status in relation to the Torah. And then we come back for the second multiplication story that has a couple of important differences to notice. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's in Matthew chapter 15, verses 32 to 39. Now, one thing that's important is that in this story, the disciples don't suggest sending the people away, because they now recognize the emptiness of the world away from Jesus, right? However, the story mentions that what is around them is not the surrounding homes and villages from the first story, but desert. It's been brought into even more stark relief that when you have been offered the Eucharist, leaving the Eucharist and looking to be filled by the surrounding world is nothing but desert. Okay? Now we have the same sacred meal structure that we had in the first story, the take, bless, break, and give. This time there are 7 baskets left over. So again, is Jesus getting a little bit better at measuring the amount, but he's still not that great at it? Well, no, of course not. What does 7 represent? Well, 7 represents basically anytime you see it in the Bible, a fullness, a kind of completion. So there are 7 baskets now, because this is the indication that after Jesus has offered the Eucharist and given it to the Jewish people, to whoever wanted it in the Jewish world, now his disciples are going out and offering it to the entire world. That just because you weren't there when he multiplied the bread and the fish, the first time, that doesn't mean you can't eat of this meal. If you are anywhere in the world, the 7 baskets tell you that you can eat of this same meal. Okay? So what does this story tell us Jesus came to do? It tells us that Jesus came to feed the world with a sacred meal that would be offered first to Israel and then to everyone else in the world, that this meal would be administered by his disciples, and that the normal limits of the material given, the normal boundaries of the food would not matter. Just as the boundaries, the physical volume of his body and blood don't matter for the offering and the spread of the Eucharist. Okay. I hope this video has given you a new appreciation for the stories of the multiplications of the loaves and fishes. Go to Matthew, go to Mark, and read them carefully, including the material that's in between. And I think it'll give you a whole new, I hope it will give you something else to reflect on and to appreciate the Eucharist and what God offers us in the Eucharist. And as I said, we'll talk about the multiplication in John when I do an episode on John in a couple weeks. Now, next week, though, we are going to the Last Supper in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This is where it all comes together. The multiplications, the messiahship of Jesus, the final sacrifice, the temple, his death on the cross. This is where it all comes together. It all comes together at the Last Supper. So if you enjoyed this video, please like it. Please subscribe to my channel, hit the bell notification, share this video, put a comment, even if you're just saying in the comment, hey, that was awesome, or hey, I like the statue of Blessed Solanus Casey that you have behind you. Whatever it is, leave a comment. Most importantly, please pray for me, and I will be praying for you. Peace.